Sorry. Okay. Right. So yeah. So the additional charge is considered investment goods. Right. So they can work in the farm, family farm, or micro enterprise. The other things child can help them is in the sense when they getting old, they can get support, financial support from their child. It's called old age security, right? Because in developing country, the social security, as we seen in United States, is very weak, or in most cases, it did not exist, right? Because that requires very strong institutions. Just remind yourself what we discussed 2 weeks ago in this like two pure simple model that expand the social security, right? Okay, so that's this simple theory of fraternity. Now, so we have a few lessons learned from this simple model, right? So fertility may be lowered if that's your policy goal, right? Okay, so some students may wondering, so why you want to have a lower fertility? Isn't that a case? So we are experiencing low fertility and we worry about the negative population growth. Okay? So actually, it is true for advanced economy, but in the less developing countries, think of African countries, think of Asian countries. So right now they're still in the stage of population growth. So they was thinking about, or their policy focus is how we can maintain the population growth, or how we can contain the population growth so that we can feed the population, so that we can achieve sustainable economic growth. Actually, back in 1950, the United Nations, or in general, so the world leader, they was worried about there's a population bomb that's going to explode in 2000. Right? But interestingly, so since 1950, there are interesting things just happens that has been characterized by the theory we just described. In most advanced economy, so this population bomb was naturally disappear or did not explode because people rationally choose fewer and fewer child. But for less developed country or developing country, okay, so they have not reached that stage yet. Okay? They're still in a stage they demand a lot of children, either for the motive to support them during old age, or they want the children to help them for their family farm, family business. Right? So now, but given the theory, so we have talked about, and then so we have few implications or lessons. Let's quickly go through. First, improve women's education role and status. So that essentially changes the test. Essentially change the opportunity cost of having children, right? And similarly, female non-agricultural wage employment, that is going to increase the opportunity cost of having child. Okay, now, so rise in family income level through shared growth. So that's going to increase your demand for other goods. And hopefully that's going to change the relative cost of a child. Right? So I guess the rest of things are similar. So essentially it's going to change the relative price through, or change the taste. Right? As we discussed in previous slides. Okay? And then those lessons offers us a framework for policy. And those are the policy useful for those developing countries who facing this population issue. Right. Okay. And then so historically, so there are conflicting perspectives. In the sense, on the one hand, people's worry population is a problem. On the other hand, people say a population is not a problem, right? And so people think it is a problem, it's just, as I just mentioned, in 1950. So we look at history with a worry about so the population growth is going to explode. Right. On the other hand, people say it's not a problem, and it's because later we realize, so with economic growth, with economic development, so this problem is going to alleviate by itself. But certainly, so this relies on the economic growth, and economic development brings more education, brings more opportunity to your population, particularly for female population, right? And also I want to highlight, so the population growth itself is not a real problem. The real problem is, so if you have population growth, whether so you have underdevelopment, okay? Whether this population growth leads to a depletion or the damage to our environment, right? Or whether this is going to cause some distributional problem, like inequality, right? So that's the main issue. Okay. Now, I guess that's also those things you can read yourself from in your textbook. Now, lots of things I want to explain to you is just look at policy approach. Okay, so these are policy approach that it can be useful for developing country, right? So again, so as I just mentioned earlier, so for developing country, their concern is more about the population growth instead of like a developed country face the negative population growth, right? So all those policy approach or those policy recommendation largely coming from the simple theory we just explained, right? So we need to improve the opportunity, we need to improve education so that people are aware, or so that people have alternative, or people have higher opportunity costs of have more children, right? So yeah, so that's those part. So I'm going to be very brief. I guess that's what I have to say. Now to close this chapter, so I'm going to discuss a case study. So we look at China versus India. Okay? So currently, China and India, they are the world two most populous nations. Both countries has over 1 billion people, respectively. Right? So in their history, so they took different approach. But interestingly, so these two approach has very similar outcome, but from their experience, we have important lessons to learn. Right? Start with China. In China in 1980, so the country or the government realized, or they believe the population growth can be a big burden on their economic growth. And then they initiate one-child policy. Right? So this policy itself has been very, very effective in terms of birth control. Okay? So if we look at the fertility rate, the fertility rate per woman declined to below 1.6 in 2013. Right? So in the US, the number is probably closer to 2. Right? But yes, this is quite effective, but this comes with a very unintended consequence. So in 2010, so the gender ratio is very unbalanced. Right? So there were 106 male versus 100 female. Yeah? So naturally, this is going to create lots of social issues, social problem. Right? Okay, so this is in China. Now, if we look at India, so back in 70, so the central government tried to implement the same things, but because their political system, it did not succeed. But however, interestingly, so they have seen similar slowing down in population growth. Right? But of course, they have similar issue like in China. They have in this have a unbalanced gender ratio. Okay? But in terms of population growth, in both cases slowing down. But in China, it's through central planning. But in India, essentially, is there's their own choice, right? And so the implication is, so with economic growth, people may automatically choose to have lower fertility rate, right? So maybe just go back to the case in China to elaborate a little bit, right? So in China recently, so the central government decided to leave this one-child policy. Ironically, the reason why they decide to leave this one-child policy is because they suddenly realized after over 30 years of one-child policy, so they are starting to experiencing decline in labor supply, and that can eventually crush their economic growth. Right? So that's why they decide to leave this one-child policy. But surprisingly, so this leave of one-child policy did not bring a rise in fertility rate as most experts predicted. And why is that? This largely because of economic growth. People start to rationally choose fewer child they would prefer. In some sense, similar to in India, even though India failed to implement this control policy, but somehow with their economic growth, and the people choose lower fertility rate. Right? So that's an interesting case I want to mention to you. Right? So let's stop here for this chapter. Now we move to the next chapter. Okay, so in this chapter, so we are going to move another topic. Again, so this topic, like, sorry, this chapter as in the previous chapter, so we just look at something happen or there's some change happened at the same time with economic development. So in that sense, the things we discussed in this chapter and the previous chapter can be a cause and a consequence of economic development, right? As usual, so I'm going to motivate this chapter by looking at the simple growth model we studied earlier. But here, so we are going to build upon the simple solo growth model by highlight an important factor that was missing in solo growth model. This is human capital, right? So human capital is defined as the accumulated stock of skills and education that worker has at a point in time, right? So human capital, you can think about like knowledge we acquire, the skills you get through training, right? So that's human capital. So this human capital has a very interesting property, but primarily through knowledge. That's the key input of human capital. It has non-rarity. So which means, so the knowledge you access or you use, right? So you cannot prevent somebody else to use or to utilize the same things, the same material, the same content, the same knowledge you're using right now, right? So this non-rarity has significant impact on one thing for the production function, which was the decrease in return. Okay, so earlier when we talk about production function, we say there's a decrease in return for capital, right? But because of the non-rarity, so the human capital will not subject to this decrease in return. Okay, and so instead, so the human capital investment has constant return to scale. So this constant return to scale is going to break these the convergence we discussed earlier, right? Because in solo growth model, because of this decrease in return, okay? And so eventually, so your growth will slow down as you accumulate more capital and more income, right? So now human capital won't subject to that constraint. So you're going to see sustainable growth. But naturally, this just highlight the importance of human capital. But where human capital coming from? Largely coming from education. Okay. So let me just briefly summarize this simple model. Okay. Now, so we are going to, the best way to understand this is we are going to divide the economy in two sectors. One sector is to produce regular consumption goods. Or you can think about the solo model. Everything here is going to summarize by the solo growth model. But again, so here's this solo growth model, we just take Z as given. Okay, just please review what we learned earlier. Now, we have another sector. So in this sector, so we are going to produce human capital. Okay, so this human capital is going to translate into the level of Z. Okay, or in some sense, now so we are going to build upon the solo growth model we studied earlier. So now we are trying to say something, the source of Z. And this source of Z is depending on how much effort we put in producing human capital. Right? So that's a crude way to think about. Now, first look at consumption. Right? Consumption is equal to total wage income, or in other words, so there's no saving. We just simplify the solo growth model. Okay? And the consumption comes from W times U times H. So W is the wage. H is your total human capital. U is what? U is the fraction of human capital we devoted for the production of consumption goods. Or in other words, you can think about, okay, so here, so you have U fraction of resource. Here you have 1 minus U fraction of resource. These resources in terms of human capital. So we allocate U fraction of resource in producing consumption goods, and the rest we go to production of human capital. And furthermore, so how we understand this this split? So you can think about, so during daytime, we go to factory, we go to business to produce consumption goods. During the night, we come to school, we study, we gain new skills, we learn new knowledge, so that we can improve our Z, so that we can produce better. This is one way to understand. The other way to understand is, so when you are young, you go to school. So this is like K to 12 plus college. And then once you graduate from college, you go to factory, you produce, right? And then you spend 1 month U fraction of your lifetime, go to college, and the U fraction of your rest of your life, go to production, right? So these two are equivalent. Right? So essentially here just says, okay, so we just divide our energy, our time, our effort into two parts. Some goes to production of regular goods, as solo model discussed. But some we go to the production of our skill, our knowledge. That was taken as exogenous in solo growth model. Right, so that's how we understand that. But here, so that's just going to help you to understand the importance of education. Because again, so how we are going to produce this human capital? We use this as input, this human capital as input, and then we produce more human capital through education. Okay. Now, this one just tells you how human capital is going to produce. 1 minus U is a fraction, as I just explained. So H is the total human capital we have. B is similar to Z. Z is technology level in production of regular goods, as in solo model. Now here, P is measuring the effectiveness in production of human capital, but essentially it's how effective are we training our future worker, or how good is the education system. Right? Okay, so now we can look at production. So actually this production equal to C, we just simplify, right? So we just think about this, just look at steady state of solar growth model, right? Okay, C equal to Y equal to Z times you allocate U fraction of your human capital, okay? So now if we go to the firm, so this is their production. This is what they need to pay, right? Because they need to pay the worker wage times the human capital they use. You end up with their profit equal to Z minus W times human capital they use. Firm's perfect competitive, this must equal to 0. You end up with W must equal to Z. Okay, so that's just for simplicity. So now given that, so in the equilibrium, you're going to see consumption equal to Z times U times H. Okay, and the human capital is going to evolve following this equation. We have seen that earlier, right? So again, so you allocate 1 minus U fraction of human capital to produce human capital. B is the effectiveness of the production of human capital. And then so we put everything together, you're going to see the equilibrium growth rate of the human capital is given by this equation. But this is coming from the simple algebra. H prime equal to B times Y minus U times H. So you divide by H on both sides, and there's minus 1 on both sides. You end up with this equation. Okay? And why this is matter? Why this matters? This matters because if you run all the, if you do all the algebra yourself, you're going to realize this is going to determine the growth of the economy, right? So why is that? It's because, let's go back to previous one. So this economy, this is your consumption. C is going to determine 3 things. Z is given. It doesn't change. U, this is a fraction of your human capital you have. And H, that's your human capital. So the only possible growth is coming from change in H. Right? So now if we look at this equation, this just tells you how H grow over time. So in that sense, this model, so the growth rate of consumption or growth rate of output is going to given by B times 1 minus U minus 1. So that is the long run growth rate in this economy. Even you have a fixed Z, but because you keep accumulating more and more human capital, so you're going to achieve long run growth. But now you may be wondering, so what policy can do, or what kind of policy can promote long-run economic growth? Certainly, that must be coming from some policy change B or some policy change U. Right, now let's go to the next slide. Change B. So let's just copy the previous one. So essentially, in this model, the growth rate coming from B times 1 minus U minus 1. Okay, sorry. So B times 1 minus U minus 1. Now, if we have some policy change B, so for example, make B increase, that's going to increase the growth rate. But if we have a policy increase B, what does that mean? Or how you can increase B? You either make education system more efficient, or you provide incentive in the school system so that the teachers, they can become more productive, so that you have a higher B, right? So this is how you can change B. But certain things, if you change B, that's going to increase the overall growth rate. On the other hand, so if we change U, so here, so if you want to reduce U so that you increase 1 minus U, meaning so people allocate more time, more effort in producing human capital. They spend more time go to education. They spend more time to go for training, right? But then, so what policy can be used? So we must provide tax or subsidy to education. Think about in the United States, or think about most advanced economy, they provide K to 12 free tuition, right? So they subsidize for higher education, right? So we live in the United States, we just take this for granted. But in developing country, this is not the case, right? So let's just say, for example, China as an example, right? So China only recently, they make K to 9 free. That's only recent. I still remember when I was a kid, okay, that's almost 35 years ago, when I was in elementary school, I still remember. So at the beginning of every academic year, okay, so we always was struggling to go to school. Why? In order to go to school, they need to also pay some like fee. They have different names. Essentially, it's probably like a sponsorship or whatever they call. But it costs a fortune. It costs probably like my parents a few months of salary. It's a lot. It's just for elementary school, right? So that actually forced some of my classmates quit from elementary school. And so you can imagine how would their life look like, if someone end up with education in elementary school, right? Okay, again, so we live in an advanced economy. You cannot really feel the pain or feel the damage of this poor education or this lack of education. But in developing country, and even in those like emerging country, so in their progress in terms of economic growth, so they have been struggling, but they made a lot of progress. But here, so make sure you understand the importance of education. Okay, so that's a kind of short introduction to highlight the importance of education. Now here, so let's see what does education means. A formula is defined as all forms of human learning, or narrowly, we define education as schooling. Okay? So there are a few facts regarding to education. Number one, demand for education is high. It's obvious, because education brings better skill, brings more opportunity. Number two, education and income are positively related. Okay? It's also obvious, right? Because with higher income, we can afford to provide better education or more education. And lastly, education expenditure is large in government budget. World average is 5% of our total GDP. This itself highlights the importance of education. Okay. Now here, so we can look at how much does the government spend. So this is the United States, right? So you can look at federal spending. These are breakdowns of federal spending, right? And so here, so you have this is like local government. Sorry, this is local government. This government including state government and local government. But overall, if you look at education for the United States, is 5.27. It's slightly above. Is slightly above the world average. Okay. Now, in the following slides, I'm going to run through with some facts regarding to education. Okay. So the first one is show us the public and private expenditure on educational institutions as a percentage of GDP. All right. Now let's see what we have. So on the top, this is primary, secondary, and the post-secondary non-terrestrial education. What is tertiary education, or here, tertiary education essentially refers to college or university. Okay? So you can see overall, so the government spent more on this primary, secondary, or non-tertiary education, because those are essential. Right? They spend less, but still they spend a lot on tertiary education. Right? This is number one. And then number two, so there's wide range of difference. But if you look at their per capita income, you should see some correlation between how much they spend and their income level or their growth level. So this is the first facts. But here, this is for OECD country. Okay. Now, if we look at this outcome, so the previous slide is for input. Now here we look at outcome. So we look at 25 to 34 years old. This is called prime age. Prime age workers who with below upper secondary education. Certainly, the higher the number, the worse the outcome. Right? So if we look at OECD country, it's less than 20%. Now, if we look at United States, it's doing quite well, less than 10%. Or in other words, so most of prime age American workers, around 10%, they have education below upper secondary education. Right? Okay, so clearly there's a correlation between level of economic development and the percentage of those adults with inadequate education. Other facts I want to point out is there's quite significant gender difference. So this triangle is for men, this square is for women, right? And you have a few countries, the difference is quite high, right? Say, for example, Turkey. There are more women receive less education, or Indonesia, right? So you may be wondering, why is that? So one possible explanation may have to do with their religion. Just keep in mind, both Turkey and Indonesia, so they are dominated by, I believe, Muslim, right? So that could be the possible explanation. But overall, it seems like men are doing worse in terms of in receiving inadequate education. Okay. Now, next one. So we look at, in some sense, this is efficiency in education, right? So here we look at adults scoring at literacy proficiency. And we just look at educational level. So this triangle essentially refers to college graduates or university with a university degree. Higher the number, meaning so their citizens doing better, right? So now far left is Japan, and the far right, so Turkey's here, and the last one, Jakarta, Indonesia, right? So that just tells you, so there's a variety of difference in terms of their efficiency of their education system, right? So now we are going to look at other aspect. Okay. So they just look at workers. Again, this is prime age worker. Their educational level, right? And so also to look at, different categories of education. One, they receive education in general or oriented or vocationally oriented Okay. So by the way, what does vocational oriented? Think about some specialized school. So their school train you becomes a technician, becomes a plumber, so on and so forth, right? So there are variety of difference, right? And let's see what patterns can we see. This should be correlated with income. So you may want to just compare with their real GDP per capita level, right? So let's go to the next one because we have a lot of the show. No, this one, this, let me see. Okay, so here I probably want to explain to you this. Okay. So this just tells you in each country what is the relative income for different degree. So this triangle is for bachelor degree. This square is for master's degree. And overall, you can see the, by the way, so this circle is short cycle tertiary, okay, just below a university. Maybe you just think about a community college. Overall, you can see across the board, higher education or better, more education you received, the higher your income. That's universally true, almost. Right? But the second fact is, so the difference is the difference between I probably just call the premium of education, right? Or the difference in terms of wage rate or earning from different level of education. So this difference or this premium varies from one country to the other country. And so what is the implication or what's the importance of this difference, or why we care about this difference? So actually, so the bigger difference gives the worker or give their households a stronger incentive to invest in education. That can lead to better accumulation of human capital, right? So that is one implication, right? Okay, so I'm going to stop here for this discussion. So let's just let me just give you some time to have your breakout, so that you can talk about your so that you can talk about your group presentation, right? So let me just create this breakout and